הניסים ועל הברכן ועל הגבורות ועל התשועות ועל הנפלאות, על הניסים ועל הברכן ועל הגבורות ועל התשועות ועל הנפלאות שעשית לאבותינו בימים ההם בזמן הזה, בזמן הזה שעשית לאבותינו בימים ההם בזמן הזה.
Welcome to Jewish Life, a program presented each week in cooperation with the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York. I'm your host, Stewart Ain. Every week we present programs of particular interest to the Jewish community, and today we're going to be speaking with Werner Reich. He's a Holocaust survivor. He's 93 years old. Welcome to the program. And I wanted to ask you about the experience and what's happening in terms of educating young people and how you do a lot of speaking to young people. What is the first thing you tell them?
The very first thing I do is I explain to the students the origin of Germany, really, and then the usage of hatred to dominate groups of people and to acquire the power over the people. The basic idea, I cannot talk really about anti-Semitism because most students are not Jewish and they cannot empathize with it. It's extremely difficult to get any empathy. But what I'm harping on is not to be a bystander, irrespective of religion. I'm trying to make it a non-religious presentation, although obviously the Jews suffered the most, but so did the Jehovah's Witnesses, so did Gypsies, so did Catholics, so did many other groups. So it wasn't. And the other thing is this: that anti-Semitism never stops with anti-Semitism. You know, once it succeeds there, it continues to other groups. But basically, my message is: don't be a bystander. Don't watch, because sooner or later it's going to catch up with you. And just basic principles of human decency. You are not a bystander. That's my message. And I use myself as an example, obviously.
Right. And can you tell us a little bit about your experience before the war? What happened to you?
Well, you see, with me, I'm one of those people where the Holocaust started very early in life. I was born in Germany, and in 1933, a whole bunch of laws came into action. My father was a mechanical and an electrical engineer, and he worked for Siemens. And in 1933, a couple of laws came into action. Number one, Jews could not work for major corporations, universities, schools.
Now, Hitler took over in January. How soon did he implement these regulations? How soon?
My recollections of anti-Semitism and so on do not exist from Germany. I was the very important thing to remember is that my parents were Victorians, and they firmly believed that children are to be seen and not heard. And any issues of problems, anything of the sort, were never ever discussed in front of children. Children were sent out of the room. And the other rule was, spare the rod and spoil the child. So it was a very tough upbringing. and a very much separation. I was not really friends with my parents. It was a time when many kids called their parents sir or madam.
Mm,
You know, I mean, this
yes,
was
right.
not unusual, was quite usual. And so I didn't have this warm relationship. I didn't, when my father died, maybe some uh, 8 years later,
Yes.
or so 6 years later, I didn't know what he died from.
Oh,
Nobody ever told me even that he was sick. That's how things, they tried to spare the children. And as a result of that, uh, most of us were really small children, although I was 13 when the whole thing started for me, actually. I didn't have the foggiest notion what was going on.
but you
I
knew that
really,
your father had lost his job at Siemens, right? Because it
he
was
lost his,
shortly after Hitler took over that he lost his
well,
job, right?
he lost his job at Siemens, and
Yes.
my sister and I, we couldn't go to school because there was no law against Jews going to school, but there was a law in 1933 over crowding of schools.
And who was weeded out? The
You,
Jews.
you'll never guess in a million years who was overcrowding the schools
Right, right, right,
and
right.
who had the judgment, you know. So uh, that was that.
Yes.
So
What,
we went to Yugoslavia.
yes, yes.
And in I was 6 years old. We went to Yugoslavia, and that's where the problem started. My father, Yugoslavia was strictly agricultural country, wasn't in the least bit interested in
No.
engineers, and my parents couldn't speak Croat. My sister and I, we learned it within about a year or so, and we started going to Croat schools. But my father had a great struggle, and then he got sick, and then he died
Yeah.
when I was about 12 years old.
Yes.
A couple of
Yes.
months later, Germany invaded Yugoslavia. My mother had been a typical German Jew. She was a nurse during World War One in the German military, and
Oh,
she was up in Poland, and she saved the whole group of German soldiers from being gassed. And for that, she won the Iron Cross. And she firmly believed that that Iron Cross will
what's
save
safer?
her. In
Yes.
addition to that, her father had been in the United States and he fought in the Civil War and he was an American. So my mother thought she was an American and she had an Iron Cross, an unbeatable combination. Right. As they say in French, with garnished helfen.
Right. So, um, so you go to Austria, to Austria. The Germans invade. The Germans invade in 1941. The Nazis invade, right? They occupy Yugoslavia,
Yes,
and
but they were not, they occupied Yugoslavia, but Yugoslavia, which had been created in 1918 out of 5, 6 different states, you know, suddenly broke up.
I see.
There was Croatia, Slovenia,
Yes,
Bosnia, Herzegovina, Serbia, and they all broke up.
right.
And
And then
they
then
only
your
got
mother's
united again under Tito, and then that broke up, and now
sure,
it's again individuals. And
but
the
your
part
mother.
that highlights Croatia was under the ruling of Ante Pavelic, who was a fascist of the worst kind. He immediately opened a concentration camp.
I see.
There were altogether 6 extermination camps under German ruling.
In Yugoslavia.
5 of them were in Poland. They were the Treblinka, Auschwitz, Belzec, and so on, Mali Trostinac. And then there was in Yugoslavia Jasenovac. So you had these 7 concentration camps, and that was that. And my mother was afraid that she was sure nothing was going to happen to her because she had that iron cross.
Sure.
Yeah.
But she was
Walking,
afraid for you.
she was afraid for me and my sister. And so she placed me with a couple, and this was sheer genius. Out of all the people she could find, she found a couple who worked for the resistance movement. Exactly the people that the Nazis were looking for.
Well, you worked for them a little bit, right?
I'm sorry?
You actually did some resistance work yourself.
Well,
Going
I
through
did
that.
for 2 years. I was developing films, and I was making enlargements, and I was doing all that stuff.
You
Uh,
did.
yeah, I did the darkroom work for about 2 years. And obviously, it wasn't the Croats who were looking for them, it was the Germans.
Yes. Yes.
And, and they eventually found them, and they arrested me, and they beat the living daylights out of me. That was questioned the Gestapo itself.
Yes.
And
And in fact, um, they beat you. Were 15 at the time,
I was
and
15, yes.
then they sent you to Theresienstadt.
Well, first I was in jail in Slovenia for 3 days, and then I was for 6 weeks in Graz in jail. Then I
Oh,
was shipped. Oh yeah, no, this is the Germans are well known for shifting people around. It's constant movement from one place
right.
to another. And then I went to Vienna, and from Vienna to Theresienstadt, and I was in Theresienstadt for about 10 months.
And then you went to Auschwitz. Now, what? There's Auschwitz II and Auschwitz I. Could you explain to our viewers what's the difference between Auschwitz II and Auschwitz I?
Well, they were basically 3 Auschwitzes. Uh, there was Auschwitz I, which was the camp that you see when you, with a big gate that says Arbeit macht frei, and they were
Yes.
the brick buildings. These brick buildings were put up for the housing of German criminals. Auschwitz I was an extension of the German penitentiaries. So the first 100
I see.
prisoners who came to Auschwitz, number 1 through number 100, were German criminals. They were murderers, thieves, sexual offenders, homosexuals, and so on. And we all had triangles on our uniforms. And these people had 2 types of triangles, either light green for repeat offenders or dark green for what they call heavy offenders. That means people who murderers.
Yes.
And the people who've been sentenced to many years in jail. So these people lived in Auschwitz I. They had better food. There were 2 or 3 prisoners per room. Remember, it was still a penitentiary, but they were put there to work in the other camps.
I
And
see.
they had a brothel there. They had a movie house. Actually, the cafeteria was used as a movie house, but they had much, much better.
Conditions. Yes.
Yeah. Auschwitz III, I'm going to talk about it very, very briefly, was basically a synthetic rubber factory, which was a few miles, couple of miles, about 2, 3 miles from Auschwitz. And they did made in synthetic rubber. And then there was Auschwitz II, which is also known as Birkenau. And that was the camp that had the crematoria, that had Dr. Mengele, that had, the gate that you see and the selections and all this other stuff. Auschwitz I didn't have any selections.
No. And you met Mengele.
And hold it, let me come back to it.
Okay.
I was in Auschwitz II and I was in Auschwitz I. I was in both. I was one of those very, very few exceptions of Jews being in Auschwitz I. And the only reason I was in Auschwitz I was because I worked in the stables. I was taking care of the horses of the German officers.
Right, right.
Sorry
But
for
now-
the long explanation.
So tell me about right. Tell me about your meetings with Mengele. You met him 3 times, right?
Well, I came from Theresienstadt, and I saw Mengele quite often. As a matter of fact, I saw him quite often. He constantly kept going through the B camp. And then on July 7th, 1944, all the young people I'm sorry, I have to step back. All the camps in Auschwitz were separated, were really special purpose. Below the railroad lines, that was the women's camp. That's where all women. And then above, at the time when I came, there were camps A through F, and 2 of the camps were, one was strictly for gypsies, where the husbands and wives and children were together, and the other one was for Jehovah's Witnesses, where again the families were together. But whenever transport from Theresienstadt came, people were split up, except when I and 2 other transports came. They kept all the men and women and children together in one camp. And that's the reason was that the Red Cross or the Swiss authorities complained that they wondered what happened to the people, and they wanted to show to them that they really were alive and happy and singing merry tunes, and were in Auschwitz. And all this happened for maybe a 6 months period of time. We got to Auschwitz, everybody got a card, a postcard, and we could write home that we are fine and everything is good.
Oh.
The cards were sent off. And then on July 7th.
So who did you write to?
Pardon?
Did you write a card to somebody?
I didn't have anybody to write to. There was nobody, I didn't, but the other people, you see, most of the people were from, in Theresienstadt, where they were basically from 3 countries, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Germany. These were the 3 countries. There were a few Danes there, and I forgot, and a few Dutch people, but basically, these were the people, and they wrote home to families that still lived there. And so on July 7th, Mengele came into the camp, and all the young people, all the young boys under the age of 18 or so, we had to strip naked and we had to run past Dr. Mengele. And we were, we were pushing out our chest, and we were smiling and trying to look as strong and as healthy as possible. And we were really skeletons, if you will. And he just stood there and occasionally nodded his head, and somebody went to the other side. When it was finished, there were roughly 300 of us. And then we had to run again, and then there were 200 of us, and then there were again. And eventually there were 89 of us. And the 89 of us, we were sent to another camp, one of these subdivisions in Auschwitz too. And the others were all, over the next 3 days, sent to the gas chambers. Everybody else was killed. And of the, I think 80, of the 90, no, 97 of us were, 97, and of the 97 or 98, of the 98, roughly 47 survived. Today, there are maybe a dozen of us still alive.
Right,
Israel,
right.
in Czechoslovakia and so on, and I'm one of them. We have a sort of a very informal organization, but called the Birkenau Boys.
Right, right.
You
Did
know,
you
it's-
realize? Did you realize when you were running in front of Megala what was going on?
By that time, we knew what the selection was. When we came to the camp, we went through a selection. But you see, when we walked into the camp, there were people from Theresienstadt already there. They came in September the previous year, and then we came in May. And they told us, you'll be here for 6 months, and then you'll leave through the chimney. And we thought it was a stupid joke,
Yes.
and it didn't make any sense.
Right.
You know, I
Right.
mean, it was sort of somebody talking drivel.
Of course.
And yet we were surrounded by the smell of burning hair and burning flesh. And we heard people screaming occasionally when they were led to the gas chamber. Most people didn't scream or didn't anything because that was the time when all the Hungarian Jews came. And they were taken from the train to the crematoria. They didn't know what the whole thing was about.
Yes.
You see, it's for instance, when the Gypsies and the Jehovah's Witnesses were taken, the two camps were wiped out. They've been there already for 6 months. They knew exactly what was
What's going on? Yes.
and they were screaming and crying, and it was horrible. I can still hear it today.
You could see the smoke too?
Pardon?
Could you see the smoke from the chimney?
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, the whole thing was. We are talking only about maybe from where we were, maybe less than 1,000 feet. You know, I mean, you're not talking about any distances. And in addition,
how far away were people living in Auschwitz? People living in, the Germans living in their homes. How far away were they? Because they said they didn't know anything about this, right? They didn't know what was going on. They just knew it was a camp.
I was liberated in Mauthausen, okay, much later. And I got to know a man who liberated me. I got to know him a few years ago, not in Mauthausen.
Right.
He happened to be living, he was living here in Port Jefferson, and, I'm maybe 10 miles from me. And we became very, very good friends. And he said they smelled Mauthausen 10 miles away. And they wondered, what the hell is that smell? And they asked the local population, and they said, what smell? They didn't... what's his name? You had it in many other camps. People just ignored it, or they got so used to the smell that they didn't smell it.
What's the thing you hear most from kids? You talk to high school kids, right? You when you speak to the school children, they're mostly high school.
Yes, middle school and high school. Yes, middle.
And what's most um, what are they most interested in? What do they want to hear from you uh, that they found hard to believe?
The problem, the big problem is that I'm talking about something that they cannot imagine, you know. And when we talk about fear, you are talking about fear that's a day or so. We've had weeks and weeks and months. When I talk about hunger, I'm talking about hunger day after day after day after day. When I talk about cold, I'm talking about cold day after day after day after day. It's a completely different, the reaction is completely different. And a combination of fear, mud, hunger, and cold is deadly. It changes it makes you extremely self-centered. You don't give a damn. When I was on the death march and people were dying next to me, I didn't give a damn.
Really?
It sounds
Really?
very cruel, but it's a question of self-preservation. You
Yes.
become a
Yes.
completely different human being.
Yes. And then you married somebody who was saved by Sir Winston Nicholas Winston. He died a little Winton. He died this year, I believe, not that long ago, right in 2020. Nicholas Winton.
What
Uh,
about it?
he died. He died in 2020, as I recall.
Who?
Uh, Nicholas Winton.
Oh, Nicholas Winton. Uh,
Yes,
he he.
he lived a long time.
Oh yeah,
Many, many.
no, he died a few years ago. No, he didn't
Oh,
die.
I thought it was recently.
He died before. Yeah, he
Okay,
died before. He,
but he lived a long life.
pardon?
He
He
lived a
was,
long
I think,
life.
105 years old, or 103 or 105.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
he saved my wife.
yes, yes.
Yeah.
That was something. Can you briefly tell us about that? How did he do? He
Well,
brought.
Nicholas Winton is a very interesting person. Although he saved 669 children. Okay, I'm going to be a little bit roundabout it. Nicholas Winton was an Englishman, a stockbroker, and he went. He had a friend who was a work as a clerk or something like that at the British Embassy in Prague, and he wanted to go with Nicholas Winton skiing. That was in 1939, and Nicholas Winton went over to uh, Czechoslovakia, and he suddenly found out that there were lots of children there who have been abandoned by their parents or parents who wanted to get their children out. And Britain had installed what they call the Kindertransport.
Yes,
Uh, they permitted children under the age of 18 to enter the British Isles, provided that they are unaccompanied by any adult, whether it's a parent or guardian. But attached to it was they had to find a 50-pound guarantee, which is roughly half a year's salary for a skilled worker, and they had to find a home for these children.
Right.
So Nicholas Winton went over to Czechoslovakia, and he, with the help of his mother in England, managed to find homes, managed to find money, and saved 669 children. And my wife was one of them. She was 5 years old, and she was with her grandparents in Prague, and she was brought over to Great Britain. She ended up in Wales in a Welsh boarding school, actually a Czech boarding school in Wales. Nicholas Winton was honored by the Queen, but he will could never ever be recognized by Yad Vashem for the very simple reason Nicholas Winton's father and his brother came to England, I think in 1901 or something like that, and their name was Wertheim. They were German Jews, and I'm not finished yet. And they converted, and they got married. And Nicholas Winton's father made a big mistake. He married a Jewish woman. So that makes Nicholas Winton, although he attended Church of England, a Jew.
Sure.
And that's why Yad Vashem will never ever recognize him.
Wow. I did not know that. Wow. That's quite
It's
a thing.
totally useless information, but it's
No, but that was quite a thing. What is it that you have an exhibit? You have photos at the Holocaust Museum in Glen Cove. When people walk in, there's a display with your photos there, right?
I'm sorry?
With your pictures. You have pictures as a kid.
Yeah,
at the
I have pictures
museum?
of myself at the Holocaust Center. I have the forged document that Nicholas Winton did for my wife is also there. I have my release from Mauthausen, a little piece of paper I have there, and I have my number from Mauthausen, which I wore in Mauthausen. I have it at the Holocaust Center. You see, after Auschwitz in January, I was transferred from Birkenau to Auschwitz I, where I worked in the stables. And then in January, we went on a 7-day death march.
Yes.
And that's where probably 3/4 of the people died. And I ended up in Mauthausen, and with my toes frozen off and my feet rotting. And then there was a soldier there from a Yugoslav soldier who was a doctor, and he cut off my toes and my feet, and that's how he saved my life.
Right.
And we had no food there, absolutely no food. Because the SS all went into the military, and the civilians were afraid to come into the camp.
Who survived? You said there was mother and your sister. Did either of them survive?
My sister survived. My sister had been placed with another family, and after a year they tossed her out, and she escaped to Italy.
Oh.
Well, from Yugoslavia, and the Italians put her in a detention camp, and she was there for a year, and then she survived. My mother died. I saw my mother in the prison yard when I was in Graz in jail. I looked through the window and I saw her walking around in the prison yard. I couldn't signal her because there were the bars and so on.
Just as coincidence. I mean, you just looked out and there she was.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow. Wow.
And it's
Wow.
you know what? Whatever you read or hear about the Holocaust, you know, it's always wow, and but then uh, it seems sort of a routine because you know the situations were, there was the most unusual ways of saving their lives and people undertook, you know, I mean, the most bizarre things that they could. I There was a choir in a Catholic, I think in the Vatican, consisting of Jews who were singing for German officials, and they were all Jewish kids singing Latin madrigals. It's
They saved themselves. Yeah. Just
sure. I was singing. I was I was forced to sing when I was in Auschwitz. We were we were the Birkenau Boys. We were forced to learn German songs, and when the certain groups of people walked out of the camp to do work outside the camp, we had to sing for them.
oh.
It
Did you
was
sing for the Red Cross too?
fun.
The Red Cross. Did you sing for them?
I no, that was be no, no, no. There was no. They came. Red Cross came while everybody was still together, but that was
Okay.
only for a couple of months, and then uh,
Yeah, that was it.
there
Yeah.
was no. The Nazis kept off. You know, they tried to show that there was no uh, imposition on their part. That it was all happy people.
Yes. And Theresienstadt was their showcase. That was the camp that was
Oh,
the show.
in Theresienstadt we had theater and we had concerts and we had lectures.
Yes.
Theresienstadt was was and
Luxury.
everybody was complaining and complaining and complaining and complaining, you know. And
Yeah.
you ain't seen nothing yet.
Yeah. You were also known as the death camp magician. What was that?
Uh, well, that was a very, very odd situation. I was in Auschwitz, and uh, let me tell you in a sort of a roundabout way. There was a man called Herbert Lev. Okay, let me do it in a disorganized way.
Okay.
I was in Auschwitz uh, shortly after I arrived, before Mengeler's selection. And I bunked in a barrack, and there were 6 people on each level. And I was up on the top level, and there was a guy next to me. Very, very nice German man. And he introduced himself as Mr. Herbert Levine. Very nice guy. And one day I came back from a work assignment, and there was Mr. Levine with a deck of cards. And you know, it was to me, it was I just couldn't fathom it because nobody had a thing. You know, there was nothing. When we came into the camp, we were stripped of everything that we had. We had our pubic hair cut. We were given just underpants and the striped uniforms and the tattoo, and that's it, finished. And there's no watches, no jewelry, no pencil, no harmonicas, nothing. And there this guy sits there with a deck of cards. And, it was totally beyond my understanding. And then he offered me, he said, pick a card. And he did a card trick for me. I have never, ever in my life seen a card trick before, because that was the realm of magicians, and magic was not very common at that time. And then he did something that I've never seen anybody do before. He explained to me how he did the trick without me even asking how he did it. He simply explained it to me. And I couldn't touch the cards, obviously not, but he explained the trick to me. And there was that. And shortly afterwards, there was the Mengele selection, and he was saved. He was amongst the very few people who were saved, and his wife, his mother, and his son were killed, were part of the Theresienstadt group that were killed. And what happened was that the Germans knew he was a magician, so they gave him some cards and some corks, and he was teaching the magician, the Nazis, magic tricks, and maybe he was practicing on me, that trick. And that was that. And we got parted. I never met him again. I went to Auschwitz I, and from there I went on the death march, and from there I went to Mauthausen, back to Yugoslavia, and so on. But he actually went from Auschwitz somewhere else to some other camp, and he survived. He ended up in Germany, and he came then to the United States, and he performed on cruise ships.
Is that right?
Yeah. He remarried. He married a woman who was a pianist, and she became his assistant. And I actually met somebody, the Reverend William Rausch, a very good friend of mine, who actually saw him perform.
On a ship?
Yeah, no, not on a ship. He saw him somewhere in New Jersey or so.
Okay.
Pennsylvania. Okay. And when I came to England after I left Yugoslavia, I bought myself some cards, and I actually performed that card trick, and it worked. And then I bought some tricks and books and tricks and all that. And when I came to the States, I joined the International Brotherhood of Magicians and the Psychic Entertainers Association, and I became a passionate magician, and I magiced ever since. But yes. I don't mention it when I speak in schools, and I never, ever perform any tricks when I speak in schools, because tricks are so much more interesting than the Holocaust.
Sure.
No, I don't mix the two. But so the Holocaust really wasn't a total waste of time.
There you go. Ben Levine, right? Ben, what was his name? Ben?
His name was Herbert Levine.
Herbert Levine, okay.
Yeah, all it. His stage name was, he took the name Levine and turned it from front to back, and it became Nivelli. Nivelle, and
the great Nivelli.
I at the end. So his name was Nivelli.
The great Nivelli.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, listen, thanks so much. It's great to talk to you. And
You're welcome.
I appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Thank you.
Been a pleasure.
Thank
Been a
you.
real pleasure. Take care of yourself.
Take care. This has been Jewish Life. My name is Stewart Ain. Until next week, have a good one.
Bye-bye.